Here we go, example number 2. So let's try and speed this up a little bit. I'm not going to do the example using algebra tiles. Probably show that in class somehow with some other examples or some kind of activity. So I'm going to go straight to, well, let's use a table. If I'm using a table and I'm wanting to factor x squared minus 8x plus 7, I think to myself, okay, what are two numbers that multiply or give me a product of 7, and those same two numbers give me a sum of negative 8. Okay, so my table is going to look something like this. Well, what are my factors of 7? Factors of 7. Of course, you could read that maybe. Factors of 7. Well, my factors of 7 are only 1 and 7, except that here we end up with a negative value. Okay, so we also are going to have to worry about incorporating negative values. Okay? So my table might look like this. Well, if I have 1 and 7, my my product would be 7. My sum would be 8. That doesn't help us because we need negative 8, does it? So I have negative 1 and positive 7. My product is going to be negative 7. Negative 1 times 7 is negative 7. My sum is actually going to be 6. Well, that doesn't help us either because we need this sum of 8. So I flip the negative sign. And 1 and a negative 7. That's going to give me a product of negative 7 and a sum of negative 6. That still doesn't work. So what's my last option? Well, what happens if they're both negative? Negative 1 and negative 7. That gives me a sum or a product of positive 7, but a sum of negative 8. So there is what I'm looking for. This is my combination of integers. I simply write down my binomial brackets, x minus 1 minus 7. Okay. Now let me show you that in a bit of a different fashion, and might be eventually where you end up, being a little bit quicker. Okay. So my polynomial is x squared minus 8x plus 7. X squared minus 8x plus 7. I think to myself, what two numbers multiply together to give me 7? Those same two numbers have to add together to give me negative 8. And I go through all these combinations in my head. All these combinations right here, I have to try in my head. Okay, so this is where knowing some of your multiplication tables and knowing how to figure out factors of numbers, because that's what we kind of worked on, factors of 7, okay? So I play with those numbers in my head. Well, 1 and 7, 7 and 1, negative 1 and 7, negative 7 and 1, or negative 1 and negative 7. Negative 1, negative 7. See how those two numbers multiply together to give me positive 7. Those same two numbers add together to give me negative 8. Those are my two numbers. I write down my binomial brackets. Because this is x squared, I put an x here, put an x here, minus 1, minus 7. Another way to look at it, or that's going to come up eventually, is if I've decided that these are my integers. So I've got my polynomial, x squared minus 8x plus 7. And I've decided that my two numbers are negative 1 and negative 7. Then my next step is, okay, not that you have to do it right here, but eventually we're going to have to when we see different questions, is what I want to do is change or decompose this middle term into those two numbers. So this becomes, I'm going to drop this down a little bit further, x squared minus 1x, I don't have to write the 1, but I did, minus 7x plus 7. So you can see how these would combine to give you your negative 8 anyway. And then eventually we're going to do some fancy stuff with this, and you can just kind of watch this. You don't have to write this down. We're going to do some fancy stuff. We're going to draw a t here. Used to be called t factoring. Now we call it factoring by grouping. Look at this first term, or this first set of two terms here. What's common between those two terms? Well, there's an x. I can factor out an x. I'm left with x minus 1. What's common between these two terms here? Well, it's going to be 7. But because this is negative, I'm going to factor out a negative 7. What does that leave me? X minus 1. See how those are the same? X minus 1. See how this gives me x and minus 7? X minus 7. And I get the same two factors. Kind of made a mess of the next example space, but that's okay. We'll figure that out when we get there. So draw a line here. And I believe these are a couple of practice questions. So I'll give you a minute or so. Well, take as much time as you want, because you're going to pause the video and take a stab at those. And when I come back, I will quickly run through the answers to those practice questions.